Good day. Today is Sunday, 12th January 2025, and I said at the very end of my program yesterday that I would touch on what appears to be signs of a deterioration, or maybe not even a deterioration, of tension between the US President Donald Trump and the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. And we've had a number of telltale signs over the last couple of days that the relationship between Netanyahu and Trump is not as good as many had thought it might be. Briefly, it appears that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not going to be travelling to the United States to attend Donald Trump's inauguration. I've heard it said that it is not the usual practice for foreign leaders to come to the United States, to Washington, to attend the inauguration of the President of the United States. And by the way, that is also true of most countries. But Israel has a special relationship with the United States. I don't think that is strongly disputed by anyone. And in addition, it's always the case with Netanyahu that he's never someone to be too concerned or too troubled by that kind of thing. And beyond that, I would have thought that it would be very much in Netanyahu's interests or in his conformity with his wishes to be seen having a meeting with Donald Trump as soon after Trump's inauguration as possible. Quite possibly, Netanyahu would want, in the normal sequence of things, to be the first foreign leader to meet with Donald Trump as President of the United States directly after Trump's inauguration, to convey to people in Israel and across the Middle East Trump's and America's continued support for Israel, but also for Prime Minister Netanyahu himself, who continues to face legal difficulties in Israel and a significant amount of criticism there. Nonetheless, Netanyahu has chosen not to come, and we are told that the reason for this is that he's concerned about the decisions, the arrest warrant against him from the ICC, the International Criminal Court. Now, as I understand it, the ICC confirmed the warrant against Netanyahu in November, but there'd been talk that it would be issued for quite a few months before, and Prime Minister Netanyahu, of course, travelled to the United States in August, where he addressed Congress. He made a very belligerent speech in Congress that I discussed extensively in various programs. I said at the time that it looked to me that Prime Minister Netanyahu was working towards an escalation against Iran, an attack on Iran. And we've now had two articles in Axios which say that in November, the Israelis sent a minister to speak with Trump, and that there was considerable pressure at that time to get the Trump team to sign up to a missile war, an attack against Iran. And we've also had another article from Axios, which again I've discussed at great length on this channel, in which we learned that Jake Sullivan and other US officials, I am sure with Israeli knowledge and perhaps with Israeli participation, were also lobbying none other than Joe Biden to launch missile strikes against Iran in the weeks before Joe Biden left the White House. And I said what an extraordinary step that would be, and that I found it extremely difficult to see how such a thing could be justified, how the outgoing president could justify launching a war against another country without first agreeing it with the president-elect, and it seemed that the president-elect was not in the loop about these discussions. And in relation to both of these two articles, both of these articles in Axios, I pointed out in various programs that it seems to me that in fact we have been witnessing a whole sequence of steps, starting perhaps going back all the way possibly to the Israeli strike on the Iranian embassy in Damascus, a sequence of steps starting from that, leading all the way to these discussions this autumn about an all-out attack on Iran. And of course there have been recently articles in the Israeli media in which the Israelis have openly discussed, there's been a public open discussion in Israel about the fact that following the collapse of President Assad's government, the Israelis have been saying that this is now the opportunity to attack Iran. Syria provided Iran with advanced warning of the movements of Israeli aircraft, the radar systems that the Syrians had, and by the way, which the Russians had in Syria, enabled the Iranians to be tipped off about Israeli aircraft movements, and also the presence in Syria of a strong Syrian air defense system, supplemented by an even more advanced Russian air defense system, meant that the Israelis could not use Syrian airspace to launch missile strikes against Iran. So everything seems to have worked toward a point in November when there would be a strike. The plan was that that was when the strike against Iran would take place. Now, when the Axios article came out about the discussion between Jake Sullivan and Joe Biden about the strike against Iran, I assumed that this whole sequence, this whole process, which began also, it seemed to me, in April, had already been agreed way back in the summer, that various people within the administration, the Biden administration, were signed up to this project, and that had Kamala Harris won the election in November, or had President Biden continued with his election bid and won the election in November, then the Democrat Party administration would have felt able to go ahead with the strikes, but the Donald Trump's victory in November made that much more difficult, because even the Democrats, even Biden himself, could see that there would be significant political difficulties in launching another war in the Middle East against militarily the most powerful Middle East country of all, which is Iran, without, in the dying weeks of an administration, without the agreement of the president-elect. Now, I'm now going to slightly modify that view now that we know two additional things. Firstly, we now know that back in November, Trump was also being lobbied to greenlight an attack, both an American and an Israeli attack on Iran. And in his recent press conference in the United States, the one in which he said many things about the process of achieving peace in Ukraine, and he gave us an interesting insight into his thinking, and in which Donald Trump also spoke about Greenland, Canada, and all of those other places. Trump was also asked questions about a potential attack on Iran. And whilst he didn't explicitly rule it out, I came away with the overwhelming impression from listening to him that he was deeply unenthusiastic about the whole idea. In fact, I got the strong impression that basically he doesn't want to do it at all. He's not looking to start another war at the very start of his presidency, and he perhaps wasn't happy that the Israelis came and asked him to greenlight it, and he was probably not happy at all to read the article in Axios or to learn from Axios about the discussions that the Biden administration had undertaken about conducting its own attack on Iran. Now, here, that brings us to a possible adjustment of the timeline, which I outlined in my previous article, in my previous program, which is that I don't know, because Axios doesn't make it clear, when these meetings with Trump himself took place. They took place sometime in November. And when the meeting in the Oval Office between Jake Sullivan and Biden took place, the one in which Sullivan and Biden discussed a possible strike against Iran. However, my impression is that though Axios has informed us about the interactions between the Israeli official and the Trump people in an article published after Axios previously informed us about the discussion between Sullivan and Biden, I get the impression from reading these two articles that the meetings with Trump, or at least with his officials and the Israelis, took place first. That the meetings, in other words, with the Israelis and the Trump team happened in November, perhaps mid to late November, and the meetings with Biden happened shortly after. I'm not saying this is true, but that is my impression. In which case, could it be that what actually happened was this? That, as I said, there was a whole series of steps taken, extending all the way back to the attack by the Israelis on the Iranian embassy in Damascus in April, a whole set of steps taken thereafter, all of which were intended to lead to the attack on Iran. There was the strike on the embassy in April. There was the assassination of Haniyeh in Tehran. There was the extraordinarily belligerent speech that Prime Minister Netanyahu made in Washington. There was also an intensifying aerial campaign between Israel and various Iranian assets across the Middle East, assassination campaigns and that sort of thing, that then culminated in more fighting in southern Lebanon and advanced by the Israeli forces into southern Lebanon, a sustained bombing campaign against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, which included the assassination first of the Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, and then by his successor. All of this was going on. And, of course, there were other things. There was the pager attacks and all of those things. But all of this was setting the scene for the big strike against Iran. And then the election took place. and instead of Kamala Harris, Donald Trump won. And then the Israelis, perhaps a week or 2 weeks after the election, sent their people to Washington to meet possibly with Trump himself, but perhaps also members of his team, and lobbied for the next stage, which was the attack on Iran. Except it turned out that Trump was not keen. He did not want to start his presidency with a new war after he had promised the American people over the course of the election that he was not somebody who had any real interest in starting wars. Trump doesn't like Iran. He doesn't like the government of Iran. He's made that clear many, many times. He, during the time when he was president, pulled out of the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, as the Israelis wanted. He imposed a policy of maximum pressure on Iran, but he always stopped short of a direct military confrontation with Iran. I forgot to mention in that sequence that he also, of course, agreed to the assassination of the Iranian General Soleimani. So Trump does not like Iran. He does not like its government, but he's never been keen on starting any new wars in any place, and he's not keen to start a war against Iran. He presumably realizes that it will be a much more dangerous and difficult project than many of those who advocated believe. And I suspect that at some level he senses that this is a neocon project, and he probably realizes that it's extremely dangerous to fall in with any neocon projects, because putting aside everything else, if he starts acting in the way that the neocons want, he risks becoming their prisoner, and that could end up jeopardizing his entire domestic and foreign policy agenda. I'm saying all of this because I don't want to give the impression that I think that Donald Trump is any kind of moderate towards Iran. I've never had that impression. Rather, it's that for entirely understandable, hard-headed reasons, as he would say, he does not want to start his presidency with a war. And so the Israelis came away from all of these meetings with Trump's people disappointed. Some of Trump's people, if we believe the Axios story, were favorable to this scheme. But overall, Trump himself was not. So they came away disappointed. And then they tried again, because, of course, the window opened up by the fall of Assad had now presented itself. And beyond that, there'd been all this hard work done over the last couple of months to set the scene for the attack on Iran. And as I discussed in one of my recent programs, Jake Sullivan, the other members of the administration, the current administration, several of them, undoubtedly were in on this. So they'd failed with Trump. Trump had said no, but Trump is not yet the president. Joe Biden is still the president. So a last attempt, one final attempt was made to get the war going, to get the attack on Iran underway, and that took the form of one final attempt to persuade Joe Biden, or the various people who advised Joe Biden, not just Joe Biden himself, of course, but all of his other various people to sign off on this thing. And obviously, it looks from the first Axios story that Sullivan was the lead advocate, though there were no doubt others, but it's clear that the project ran into opposition. And I'm going to make a guess that the major opposition came from the Pentagon and from members of the US intelligence community, who have repeatedly said that they still see no evidence that Iran is moving purposefully ahead with a nuclear weapons program, the intended justification for the war, and who probably understand that a war against Iran is an exceptionally risky proposition, despite all of the claims about the weakening or supposed weakening of Iran, which have been made over the last couple of weeks. So, that's, I suspect, what happened. Well, Biden probably was informed of the fact that Trump has for the moment said no. I suspect that his advisors, his other advisors, people other than Sullivan and perhaps Blinken, told him that starting a war with Iran at this time, in the final weeks of his presidency, was also an extremely risky and very, very bad idea. The Pentagon, as I said, probably opposed it. And anyway, the whole thing failed. It was called off. And then, of course, we've had the press conference, Trump's press conference, in which, as I said, he's made it fairly clear, at least to me, that for the moment at least, he's not keen on this whole project. I'm not saying that he never will be, or that he can't eventually be talked round, but for the moment at least, he doesn't seem to want it. And that's one thing that I suspect might have happened. And of course, it could very well be that all of this lobbying by the Israelis, first of Trump himself, and then of Biden, which Trump will not have been happy with, to start a war in the Middle East, that could have created difficulties between Netanyahu and Trump. Now, all of this, up to this point, it's not pure speculation. These contacts between the Israelis and the Trump team undoubtedly did happen. We have the information from Axios, the meeting between Biden and Sullivan in the Oval Office. It also happened. But to some extent, at least, I am joining up the dots. However, we now have a number of other things which have happened, which further point to the stress, the coolness at this moment between Netanyahu and Trump. Firstly, as I said, there was Netanyahu's decision not to travel to the United States to go to Trump's inauguration. Now, as I said, this has been justified on the basis that there is an ICC warrant against Netanyahu. Now, my understanding is that the International Criminal Court only issued the warrant in November. And of course, Netanyahu previously traveled to the United States in August before the warrant was actually issued. But I cannot truly believe that Netanyahu would have been seriously discomforted by the existence of the warrant if he was intending to travel to the United States. The United States has made it absolutely clear that it will not enforce the warrant against Netanyahu. The US government, the Biden administration, has spoken up strongly against it and has strongly criticized the International Criminal Court. The Trump team are equally critical. Congress is overwhelmingly hostile to this warrant, and in fact, they've just passed a bill. They voted on bills which appear not only to effectively undermine the status of the International Criminal Court, but potentially expose the court itself, its officials, and people who work with the court to enforce these warrants, to sanctions. Just saying. And anyway, I'm not sure that Netanyahu would need to stop over in any European country which might enforce the warrant against him in order to travel to the United States, if that was what he wanted to do. I say this because I'm not sure what the range of modern aircraft is, but I presume that a long-haul airliner, say a Boeing 747, could travel one way directly from Israel to the United States, to the east coast of the United States, without having to make any special stopovers. And I'm fairly confident that if a stopover were needed, it could be made in some friendly country, perhaps on the west coast of Africa, which could be relied upon not to enforce the warrant. Anyway, I don't buy this idea. I'm, as I said, fairly sure that if Netanyahu had really wanted to go to the United States, he could have done. The fact that he has chosen not to do so, I think, is a strong sign that he feels that the relationship between himself and Trump at the moment is rocky, and that he is worried that Trump might snub him. Now, something else has now happened, which I think clearly shows that there is a coolness at the moment, perhaps even an anger, between Trump and Netanyahu. And that is that Trump has now republished on Truth Social a video of comments made by Professor Jeffrey Sachs, no less, immensely critical of Prime Minister Netanyahu. Now, the comments are excoriating, and they are wonderfully well said, if I may say so. Professor Sachs, obviously, as those of you who follow the Duran will know, is a regular guest on the Duran. He's somebody for whom I have enormous respect, the highest regard. I think his programs with us on the Duran are some of the best that we do, if I am going to say it straightforwardly. I have found him most enlightening, most educational in listening to the many things that he has had to say about many topics. And I would be absolutely overjoyed if Donald Trump would seek advice from someone like Professor Sachs. I mean, he's spoken sense about the Middle East, about Israeli politics, which he seems to know very well, about the conflict in Ukraine, about the whole direction of US foreign policy, about many, many matters indeed. So I would love it if Donald Trump did, in fact, seek out Professor Sachs and seek him out for advice. And I cannot imagine a better person, other than perhaps Professor Mearsheimer, just to say, who could advise Donald Trump on foreign policy, on the conduct of foreign policy, than Professor Sachs. And by the way, if you want to see what Professor Sachs himself has had to say on the Duran about the same topics that he discussed in these comments he's just made, which Donald Trump posted. Well, Glenn Deason and myself were privileged to do a video with Professor Sachs in which he spoke for about an hour discussing many of these very same issues. This, as I said, after President-elect Trump had already republished his words. Now, having said all of these things about Professor Sachs, I'm not aware that before then President-elect Trump had shown any particular recognition of Professor Sachs at all. I am sure that he has known about him, and I've never heard him say anything critical about him, but I've never been aware that he's ever republished any of Professor Sachs's comments. And besides, the things that Professor Sachs was saying in those comments that Trump republished about Prime Minister Netanyahu and about the direction of Israeli policies was such that I'm quite sure that Prime Minister Netanyahu would be vehemently angry to see republished by his erstwhile friend, Donald Trump. So the fact that Trump has done that, and Trump must know that Netanyahu is going to be very angry by this publication. The fact that Trump has done that must have infuriated Netanyahu considerably. And by the way, it's a story, the fact that Trump did this thing, that he published Jeffrey Sachs's words, it's been heavily picked up in Israel itself. I've seen discussions of this in all sorts of places, from Haaretz, at the far liberal, anti-war side of the Israeli spectrum. I'm not sure that Haaretz is exactly anti-war, but they're certainly very, very critical of Netanyahu's policies. So from Haaretz, more conservative, more pro-government publications have published this, the fact that Trump republished Professor Sachs's words as well. And this has certainly caused a stir in Israel. Now, if we want to assume that Trump is a petty, vindictive person, the kind of things that we read all the time that he is in all kinds of newspaper articles and publications published right across the world, you could perhaps say that Trump is simply annoyed because Netanyahu is refusing to come to his inauguration. But I don't believe that. I think that this betrays a much more serious difference. One of the main points that Professor Sachs has made and is making is that President Trump, President-elect Trump, and others need to be extremely careful in their dealings with Prime Minister Netanyahu, because Netanyahu is many things, but he's also very clever and extremely manipulative. And if you give the impression that you agree with him on anything, then you can find yourself in serious trouble. I should say, by the way, that it's absolutely in everybody's interests to go to the original comments of Professor Sachs and to see what he has to say there. But anyway, it could be that President Trump, President-elect Trump, what attracted him to Professor Sachs's comments was this characterization of Netanyahu, which, by the way, is true. Just to say, this is, I think, an objective truth. Prime Minister Netanyahu is many things. He can also be outwardly very charming, and like many people who come across as very charming, the reality is that he is extremely manipulative, as many politicians and foreign leaders are, just say. So I think that that might have been something that Trump noticed and wanted to publish. And it could be that all of this is a sign that Trump is angry with Netanyahu because he feels angry about the way in which Netanyahu has, over the last couple of weeks, tried to bounce him, which is to say Trump, and the United States into a war with Iran, which Donald Trump, at this point, doesn't want. Now, there is another possible issue between Netanyahu and Trump, which I have seen referenced by a number of people, including in Israel itself. I don't know how much weight, however, to place on it. Now, there is no doubt that during Donald Trump's first term, Netanyahu and Trump had a very friendly relationship. But I remember how after the November 2020 election, the election whose results Trump contested, Trump was deeply incensed and apparently felt betrayed by the fact that his friend Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, congratulated Biden as the winner of the November 2020 election. Now, I have heard, and I have recently seen it said in more than one place, that ever since then, Trump has borne a grudge against Netanyahu about this, and that he's not forgotten or taken lightly this, which he sees as a betrayal, and that it is this which explains much of the current coolness between the two men. Now, I'm a little skeptical about this, and the reason is that I think it plays too much into the commonly accepted caricature, if you like, of Donald Trump that we read about every day in almost every single newspaper, that he is an egotistical, touchy, oversensitive personality, somebody who never forgets a slight, harbours grudges, and that sort of thing. For the record, I myself have not ever actually seen any real evidence of it in Donald Trump's own actions. I mean, he said various things about various people who've crossed him. He's often expressed anger towards them. But I've never got the real sense that he's somebody who bears grudges and plots revenge in quite the way that people say. But having said that, I don't know Donald Trump personally. I'm unlikely ever to do so. So I can't say that that is the case. Perhaps Trump did feel deeply betrayed by Netanyahu back in 2020, in the autumn of 2020. Perhaps he's never forgiven fully Netanyahu for that. Maybe there is that has led to a coolness in the relationship between the two men, which hadn't existed before. And maybe that does explain a lot about the tension that exists or appears to exist between the two men now. I prefer to believe, and I will say it frankly, I would like to believe that it is more substantive things, that Trump understands that a war against Iran is an incredibly bad idea, and as I said, doesn't like being bounced into it by Netanyahu, and is making it very clear to Netanyahu that he doesn't want that to happen. But in a sense, at this particular point in time, it doesn't matter. I think we now have enough evidence, certainly with the publication by Trump of this video, that there is definitely tension between these two men. Now, that then takes us forward and makes us ask what is indeed going to happen over the next couple of weeks and months. For the moment, it looks as if there has, somewhat surprisingly, been a de-escalation in tensions between Israel and Iran. The much talked about Israeli strike on Iran for the moment is not happening. The Biden administration has ruled out, eventually, after an internal discussion, conducting such a strike in the last weeks that Biden himself is in office. Donald Trump, as I said, for the moment, does not seem to be keen on that idea. The Israelis have their hands full with the situation in Syria, where they are finding themselves on a collision course with Turkey. Turkey, by the way, is becoming increasingly angry. Turkish Foreign Minister Fidan has started to speak very angrily about possible French intervention in Syria. It seems astonishing that Emmanuel Macron, it's a testament to his incredible vanity, that President Macron of France, apparently having failed to get his expeditionary force to Ukraine, is now talking about sending an expeditionary force to Syria and positioning them as some kind of peacekeeping force, basically to protect the Kurdish enclave in eastern Syria from Turkish attack. Anyway, the Turks are absolutely furious about this. They have made all kinds of incredibly critical and rude statements about France, accusing the French of hiding behind America's skirts, which in effect also criticizes the United States, by the way. And as I've discussed in recent programs, relations between Turkey and Israel, at least at a rhetorical level, going through a period of strain, and the Israelis are even talking about a possible war between themselves and Turkey, and there are articles appearing in the United States in the neocon media suggesting the same. So with all of that, there doesn't seem to be, at the moment, any real push for a war with Iran. But of course, everything can change in the Middle East. Trump can become president. The Axios story spoke about Iran being within days of enriching uranium to the level that they could move forward quickly to create a nuclear weapon, if that's what they decide to do. And there's also, of course, talk that in October, the UN resolutions that were passed following the agreement of the JCPOA expire, and it will not be possible at that point to reverse the cancellation of the sanctions that were eased after the signing of the JCPOA. So that supposedly provides an end point before action can be taken. And the Axios article spoke about a huge crisis in the Middle East and about a G7 meeting, saying ominously that the problems in Iran could be the biggest and hugest priority in 2025. So it's not impossible that Donald Trump, after he becomes president, will find himself again exposed to renewed pressure to start a war against Iran. The Axios article said that maximum pressure was unlikely to work, which is probably true, by the way, and that instead he should therefore think about beginning a war. And, well, I think that Trump has made his feelings clear, but we can never be certain, absolutely certain, that he won't bend to this pressure. I would say two things, however. Assuming that this analysis that I've set out is correct, and do bear in mind, Trump did republish Professor Sachs's comments. That is a very, very public action, and Trump did do that. And as I said, he did seem deeply unenthusiastic about a strike on Iran in his press conference, or at least that was my impression. Assuming that Trump really doesn't want a war against Iran, that does at least give us some hope that such a war might not happen. It may be a slender thread to hang one's hope on, but it is better than nothing. It does suggest that Trump, and I suspect others close to him, J.D. Vance, perhaps, I don't know, that none of them are particularly keen on a major escalation of the crisis in the Middle East, such as would undoubtedly happen in the event that there was a war between the United States and Israel on the one hand and Iran on the other. And incidentally, there's also a significant amount of reporting in the Israeli media that Israel is now coming under intense pressure from the Americans. And this doesn't seem to be just the Biden people, which would be pressure that the Israelis could ignore, but pressure from the Trump people as well to agree to a ceasefire in Gaza, one which would allow the remaining hostages under Hamas control to be released. Tragically, they are said to number just 20, according to some US intelligence estimates. But in return, it seems that Israel might be expected to release several thousand, perhaps 2,000 Palestinian prisoners, just saying. So there is pressure there. And we must also allow for the possibility that Netanyahu's strategy over the previous year, which seems to have been to push as hard as he wanted, counting on his friends in the Biden administration and President Biden's own weakness to enable him to go on pushing for war harder and harder, and at the same time seeking to outweight Biden so that his friend Donald Trump could enter the Oval Office. It does start to look as if that calculation by Netanyahu's, if Netanyahu did make that calculation, which by the way, I think he did, that might not be playing out exactly as he expected. On the contrary, it looks to me as if he's substituted a very weak president, easily guided and manipulated by his advisors, with another president who is a much stronger personality and who, at least to some extent, dominates his advisors as opposed to being dominated by them. Just saying. So it could be that Netanyahu has made actually a big miscalculation and mistake. Anyway, I set out all of this. As I said, there's no doubt that there is some substance to all the points, some concrete facts underpinning all the things that I've said. We've had those two articles in Axios. We've had Trump's comments at his press conference. We've had Trump's republication of Professor Sachs's words, which is perhaps the most important telltale indicator of all. And we've also had Netanyahu's decision to stay away from Trump's inauguration. So things in the Middle East look rather more complicated than they used to. And perhaps for those people like myself who believe in peaceful outcomes, or at least seeking peaceful outcomes, rather than this constant resort to war, that offers a little hope. It may be that the new administration is going to be less of a pushover for Netanyahu than the existing one was. I know that goes against much of what most people had expected, but it could be true. It could be true. Meanwhile, I'm going to say something else. In terms of achieving stability in the Middle East, I stress again, long-term stability in the Middle East. The pending security agreement between Iran and Russia, or partnership agreement between Iran and Russia, as Alex Christoforou and I recently discussed on the Duran, is potentially a very important stabilizing factor. Because if the Russians do commit to beefing up Iran's air defense system and integrating it with their own, making it much more difficult and very dangerous to attack Iran in the way that the neocons and the Israelis and Prime Minister Netanyahu have been endlessly urging, then perhaps, just possibly, it would take the idea of an attack on Iran off the table. And if that happens, then there is at least a chance that the Iranians also will finally take their idea of developing nuclear weapons also off the table. Now, I say that. The Iranians, of course, have always said that they have no plans to develop nuclear weapons. But recently, as I've discussed in a series of programs, they have been hinting that under the pressure of events in the Middle East, that is what they might do. I'm now coming round to the view that some of those statements might have been intended to put pressure on the Russians to make further commitments to Iran in military and security terms in advance of the signing of that partnership agreement. Because the Iranians know that the Russians absolutely do not want Iran to become a nuclear weapons power. The Russians, for many reasons, are deeply hostile to further nuclear proliferation. And the Iranians also probably calculate that hinting to the Russians that unless the Russians make those commitments, Iran might decide to go nuclear, might have been a way of gaining leverage over the Russians. The fact that the security agreement is going ahead is the strongest possible sign that nuclear weapons development in Iran is probably going to be called off. The Russians are most unlikely, I would have said inconceivably unlikely, to enter into a security agreement with an Iran they knew was about to go nuclear. And the fact that the Russians are going ahead with that agreement strongly suggests that they've received categorical assurances that that is not going to happen, and that those assurances were given by the Iranians on the understanding that this modified and beefed up security or partnership agreement with the Russians is indeed going ahead. Now, that would also be a stabilizing factor in the Middle East if any possibility of Iran going nuclear were properly and conclusively taken off the table. I accept that people like Prime Minister Netanyahu will never accept that. But if even if all governments can see that that is never going to happen, again, it changes the calculus. It would enable the Russians, for example, in their discussions with Trump, to tell Trump, look, you don't need to worry about Iran anymore because we are in Iran and we can absolutely guarantee to you, we have it in our power to guarantee to you that the Iranians are not going to go nuclear because we're not going to let them. Just saying. So if all of that happens, then we might start to see the first return to a very unstable stability in the Middle East. It would not be peace, and it would not be real stability. Real stability in the Middle East will only be achieved once the Palestinian problem, I know many people in the Palestinian territories will not be happy that I've just used the word Palestinian problem. The Palestinian issue, the plight of the Palestinian people, is finally and properly addressed. That unfortunately remains a vast problem, and tragically it is going to be one that I'm afraid will have to be resolved on another day. But at least for the moment, the worst immediate outcome, which is an all-out war in the Middle East, just possibly, it could be that it is being avoided. Certainly, this combination of events, the tension between Netanyahu and Trump, of which, as I said, there are now concrete signs, and the partnership agreement between the Iranians and the Russians, all of that gives me some hope that it is. Anyway, I've gone into some detail about all of this today. To reiterate again, and finally, I don't think one can run away with the idea that all is going to be well in the Middle East over the next year, or that war between Iran and the West, Israel and the United States, is definitely not going to happen. We are, after all, talking about the Middle East, and there remain incredibly dangerous actors at play. So it's just that I think that the risks of that all-out war, I think today that the risks of that all-out war have, to a certain extent, diminished. And anyway, I hope so. And we'll just have to see. Now, let me now turn to that other big crisis, the one we have in the war in Ukraine. Now, the first thing to say is that over the last couple of days, we've had the Ramstein meeting in Germany. As I've already discussed, it came up with meager proposals for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are going to receive a certain increase in weapons, but nothing like to the level that they would probably desire. President Zelensky floated the idea of NATO troops going to fight the Russians in Ukraine. Nobody seems to be keen on that idea in NATO anymore. Kellogg is not visiting Kiev after all. Trump and Putin look like they're going to move ahead and meet at some point in the next few weeks, and diplomatic process will then begin. In the meantime, on the battlefronts, the situation for the Ukrainians continues to get worse. Now, I've been giving really sketchy summaries of the situation on the battlefields because, in a sense now, it is all of the same. Every day, the Russians advance, and the pace of that advance continues to accelerate. The last 24 hours there's been reports that the Ukrainians have sent more reinforcements into the Kursk pocket to try to hold back the Russians. There are said to be 60,000 Ukrainian troops now in the Kursk pocket, which would be an incredible number if it were really so. I'm not really convinced that that is the case, by the way. Just a few days ago, as I remember, it was said that there were only 12,000 Ukrainian troops there. But anyway, now I've seen another report saying it's as many as 60,000. President Zelensky has again claimed that his men have captured 2 North Korean soldiers, and he's provided us with the photographs which purportedly prove it. Well, we'll see what comes of that. But anyway, in Kursk, the Russians have made further advances towards Malaya Lochnia, in other places in the Kursk pocket. Every day, the Russians gain more ground, recover more ground in the Kursk pocket. And, well, Big Serge has done a really good article on his Substack blog in which he discusses the fighting in the Kursk pocket in great length, and I'm not going to go there. I will simply say that he makes the absolutely correct point that this Ukrainian grouping, however large it now is in an inherently unstable situation, because it's fanned out across a still significantly sized pocket, but it depends for resupply on a single road, which the Russians now have under drone and artillery control. They can strike vehicles on this road. But anyway, the Ukrainians are now coming up with a new explanation of why, despite everything, despite losing all these men and machines in the Kursk pocket, they have to stay in the Kursk pocket. If they withdrew, this is from the Wall Street Journal, if they withdraw from the Kursk pocket, then the very large Russian forces now in Kursk would advance into Sumy region and would then advance towards Kiev, presumably. To stress, that is a rationalization of the continued and bizarre decision to cling on to the Kursk pocket and to continue to send reinforcements there. It is not a reason to do so. The Ukrainians are saying that they're trying to inflict attrition on the Russians to prevent the Russians from advancing further westwards, ultimately towards Kiev. The people who are suffering the heaviest attrition in the Kursk pocket are the Ukrainians. It is the Ukrainians' ability to mount a long-term defense in this area which is being undermined, not the Russians' ability to mount a long-term offensive in this area. On the contrary, with every day that the fighting in the Kursk pocket continues, the prospects for a future Russian offensive in this area towards Kiev grow brighter. That's just my own view. But anyway, that's the situation. Meanwhile, we had all kinds of information elsewhere on the battlefronts. There were reports, for example, that the Russians have not only advanced significantly in their bridgehead on the west bank of the Oskol River, but that they have also captured the small town of Dvorichne west of the Oskol River, putting them in a very, very strong position to advance south towards Kupiansk and indeed north towards Volchansk if that's what they were to decide to do. So a deteriorating situation there. Then for some days we've known that the Russians have a bridgehead on the west bank of the Zherebets River at a place called Ivanivka, not that far from the town of Liman, close to Slavyansk. And then this morning, there was a rather strange announcement that the Russians, from the Russian Defense Ministry, that the Russians have also captured a village called Kalinovo in Kharkiv region. Now, the only Kalinovo I can find on any map is a village of Kalinovo on the west bank of the Zherebets River, or at least, on the, I believe, the Oskol River, close to another small town called Barova, which is located on the east bank of the Oskol River. Now, it's known that the Russians are working towards an attack on Barova, but if they have also crossed the Oskol River in this area and have actually captured this village of Kalinovo on the west bank, then I would say that this is a very severe operational crisis for the Ukrainians indeed. Now, there's said to be very heavy fighting underway in Chasiv Yar. There are some suggestions that the Russians are now storming Chasiv Yar, that the Ukrainian grouping in Chasiv Yar has been trapped in two cauldrons. I'm not there, I don't know, but that's what the reports from both sides say. Who's to say? There are lots of films now coming out of Toretsk, and these films, these pictures of Russian soldiers raising flags and doing all sorts of things and knocking down Ukrainian flags, all of those cumulatively suggest to me that Toretsk has completely fallen under Russian control. There may be one or two holdouts amongst Ukrainian troops in a few places. I'm not sure about that, but certainly the Russians seem to be operating in the fields north of Toretsk and in every area in Toretsk which the Ukrainians are reported to still have a presence. We get film every day or so which shows that the Ukrainians are not actually there, but that the Russians are. So I'm starting to think that Toretsk might actually by now be under Russian control in its entirety. Though, curiously, none of the bloggers or reporters on either side, nor the Russian Defense Ministry, nor of course the Ukrainians, are saying as much. But anyway, quite a lot of news there. Further west, the Russian advance southwest of Pokrovsk and west of Selidovo and Kurakhovo appears to be intensifying. The Russians captured another village called Yantarnya, which is one of the few villages left that the Ukrainians still control south of Kurakhovo. There's pictures of 3 Russian soldiers and a dog, by the way, in a video raising the Russian flag over this village. And the Russian Defense Ministry has confirmed that it has indeed fallen under Russian control. There are reports that the Russians are now in the process of surrounding the Ukrainian troops in the village of Dachny, to the south of Kurakhovo. There's some puzzlement that the Ukrainians are still there. It's been suggested that they haven't been able to leave because they are actually surrounded. Who knows? And there are also reports that the Russian operation in Velikaya Novosilka is now very much underway, that a small village, outer suburb of Velikaya Novosilka called Niskuchny has now been captured by the Russians. This has been contested, but it looks as if the fighting is underway there. And there are further reports that the Russians have entered another village, which is really another small suburb of Velikaya Novosilka, that the Russians have entered this village of Vremenka as well. If both of these villages are collapsed, then it's game over. The Ukrainians, as everybody acknowledges, would have no ability to go on fighting in Velikaya Novosilka anymore. So, a rapidly deteriorating picture for the Ukrainians on every conceivable battlefront. But still, a strong reluctance in the West to acknowledge this fact. Now, yesterday, Admiral Kirby, the outgoing press spokesman of Biden's National Security Council, made all sorts of comments, principally about the oil sanctions and other things. But he also said that at the present time, neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians are prepared to negotiate. Now, this has to be qualified. I think that the Russians, for the moment, with the momentum on the battlefields working very much in their favor, are under no particular pressure to negotiate, just saying. But with the Ukrainians, it's different. The Russians have repeatedly said that even though they're winning the war, they're at least prepared to sit down and talk to the Ukrainians and do so without preconditions. Though, of course, they've made it fairly clear what outcomes they expect from the war. It is the one that Putin outlined in his speech to the foreign ministry back in June. The Ukrainians, for the moment, are still sticking to their position that they're not prepared to negotiate with the Russians at all, even though, since they are losing the war, it would be presumably in their interests to bring the war to an end. Zelensky has at various times spoken about a diplomatic solution, but one achieved, apparently, without negotiations. The diplomatic solution giving him essentially pretty much all he wants, especially NATO membership. And the Russians, obviously, are not going to agree to that. So the Russians at least are going through the motions of saying that they are prepared to sit down and negotiate. It is the Ukrainians who are saying that they are not. And they continue to receive support from this from some of their Western allies. So I'm going to venture a guess. I think that the first 100 days of Donald Trump's presidency are going to be mostly taken up with General Kellogg and Trump trying to persuade Zelensky to sit down and talk to the Russians and at least negotiate properly. And I suspect that Zelensky and his people, based on what they've been saying up to now, will resist doing so. There's been various articles in all sorts of places pointing out how Zelensky's position would come under threat if he did sit down and negotiate with the Russians. So the Ukrainians probably will not do so. At the end of that 100 days, the Americans will turn around and tell the Ukrainians, well, we've done what we can. We have used up all the remaining money that was allocated by Congress in April last year. We're not in a position to support you anymore. We've got more important things to talk about with the Russians and indeed to do in the world. And from this point, you're on your own. And if your European friends can help you, then it is up to them. But it is no longer any business of ours in the United States. And I have a feeling that this is the direction in which things are starting to move. Neither Kellogg nor Trump have explained what they will do if there is a negotiated settlement after the end of that 100 days. But that seems to me perhaps the most likely outcome. Anyway, we shall see. For the moment at least, the key thing is that the Russians are winning the war. Now, a narrative is now, however, being sedulously plugged by those who still want to keep the war going. And this narrative, which is a variation of the narrative that we've heard many times, is that it is not true. The time is working on Russia's side. The Russian economy supposedly is cracking. There is now growing strains within the Russian economy. Inflation is out of control, except of course that it isn't. The country is overspending. It cannot sustain the war mobilization that it is undertaking. And therefore, all we have to do is to keep up the pressure just a little bit more, and the whole house of cards will come tumbling down. And at that point, we can dictate peace. The kind of peace that we thought we would be able to dictate back in February 2022, when we first imposed the sanctions upon Russia. Now, there's been an article about this in the Financial Times by Martin Sandbu, and it makes exactly the point he said. Russia's war economy is a house of cards. The financial underpinnings look increasingly fragile. Now, the article, of course, works on the premise that Russia is running a war economy. Russia, as I said, by most estimates, is committing around 6% of its GDP to military and military-related matters. Now, that is not a percentage of GDP that is consistent with a war economy. Donald Trump wants to raise defense spending in Europe to 5% of GDP, would only be just slightly below this Russian figure. Always, of course, if you accept it's true, which, by the way, I do for all kinds of reasons. But anyway, Mr. Sandbu still believes that Russia is running a war economy. And he cites comments supposedly made by Sergei Chemezov, the chief executive of Rostec, and Elvira Nabiullina, though he doesn't actually quote them in any way that I can find. But anyway, he then goes on to say that in a war economy, you're appropriating already employed resources to military ones, and this means shifting them away from their previous uses into the needs of war. And he says that this can only be done through three ways: borrowing, inflation, and expropriation. And he says that Putin's conceit is that he can go on funding the war without financial instability or significant material sacrifices. Nothing, by the way, that Putin has ever said himself would conform to that view. Putin has never spoken in that way. But anyway, that's Martin Sandbu's view of what he says. And then Martin Sandbu goes on to say that a new report by Russia analyst and former banker Craig Kennedy highlights the huge growth in Russian corporate debt. And there has been a big rise in Russian corporate debt. He says it has soared by 71% since 2022 and dwarfs new household and government borrowing. And he then goes on to say, this is Martin Sandbu, Russia is engaged in massive money printing, outsourced so that it does not show up on the balance sheet. Kennedy estimates the total at about 20% of Russia's 2023 national output, comparable to the cumulative on-budget allocations for the full-scale war. We can tell from the Kremlin's actions that it sees two things as anathema: visibly weak public finances and runaway inflation. So he says that the government, therefore, won't run a big deficit, which is true. There's no big budget deficit. And at the same time, it doesn't want inflation to get out of control. So high interest rates are enough to keep price growth within bounds. But this huge build-up in debt, nonetheless, ultimately is storing up a credit crisis as the loans eventually go bad. The state may bail out the banks if they don't collapse first. Given Russia's experience of suddenly worthless deposits, fears of a repeat could easily trigger self-fulfilling runs. This would not destroy not just the banks, but the government's legitimacy. And in short, Putin does not have time on its side, and the sanctions, all we need to do is crank up the sanctions a little bit more and all will be well. The trouble with this analysis is that it completely disregards, again, what the Russians themselves have been saying. The Russians absolutely acknowledge that there has been a major increase in lending to the private sector over the last 2 years, since 2023. What Martin Sandbu, however, doesn't seem to recognize is that the government and the central bank are trying to rein this lending in. Far from encouraging money printing, they see it as a problem precisely because it is leading to overheating and to higher inflation. If we go back to 2022, what happened is that directly after the sanctions were first imposed, the central bank did two things. First, it raised interest rates, and then, in order to ensure that the domestic economy, despite the higher interest rates, continued to be funded, what it then did was that it relaxed bank lending rules. It allowed banks to lend more in order to keep the economy running by allowing them to reduce the amount of reserves that they still had to keep in order to keep themselves stable. And then what happened was that halfway through last year, this ignited a runaway investment boom. Real living standards were starting to grow, partly as a result of the additional spending by the war, more because of the tightness on the labour market. That caused demand to rise. Companies in Russia seeing opportunities caused by the pullout of Western companies then began an aggressive expansion, and they started to borrow heavily from the banks. And they were able to do that because the central bank, over the course of 2022, 2023, began to cut interest rates, which fell to around 7% at one time. The central bank's rate was about 7% at one point. At a time when the central bank had not yet told the banks that they needed to toughen up their lending rules and to start putting money aside for reserves. So the result was, starting from midsummer of last year, there was in Russia a big investment boom, and that obviously was to some extent driven by a big rise in corporate lending, undoubtedly, 71%, no doubt, as Mr. Craig Kennedy says, and there's no reason to doubt that that is true. And this, in turn, this investment boom has increased demand and wages even further, has resulted in overheating, which is why inflation has grown. However, from the summer, the Russian government and the Russian central bank have acted to rein in the investment boom. They want it to fall so that bank lending starts to fall. Back in the summer, the central bank began the process of raising interest rates, which now stand, of course, at 21%, and they also reversed the decisions of early 2022 and started to insist that banks again had to set aside money. They had to meet capital requirements before they could engage in extra lending. And according to a recent statement by the central bank, all of this is now starting to have an effect. The central bank is now saying that, in fact, the situation in the economy is stabilizing, that, in fact, lending growth is falling because of these measures that the central bank has taken. And in fact, you can just go to the central bank's most recent statement, published on the 28th of December, and they talk about the existing tightness of monetary conditions, leading to growth in lending and aggregate demand in 2025 slowing down more rapidly than assumed in the central bank's October forecast. This will help curb price growth and lower inflation expectations, even given the mounting inflationary pressures over the recent months. Due to the considerable slowdown in the growth of lending, so there's already been a considerable slowdown in the growth of lending, it was decided to assess whether these changes were robust and how quickly they would impact price dynamics. The participants noted that if lending resumed growing at an elevated rate and inflation trends did not reverse, the central bank scheduled meeting in February, might have to consider the option of raising the key rate further. So, there is no government encouragement for this investment boom, for this huge surge in corporate lending. When people like Martin Sandbu say that what the government is doing is, in effect, printing money by forcing the banks to lend to companies, the reality is almost the diametric opposite. The authorities are trying to prevent extra lending, extra borrowing by the banks, extra lending by the banks and borrowing by companies, because they see this as a problem and they worry that this is causing overheating and inflation to go too high. Now, all of this is there. It's all there in the published documents of the Central Bank of Russia. It is there also, by the way, if you go to the Economics Ministry and the Finance Ministry, they all discuss all of this quite openly. There is nothing opaque or mysterious about Russian government policies on the economy. I simply do not understand why people continue this practice of writing reports and articles that ignore all of this. You can argue, if you wish, that what the central bank is saying here isn't true, that they're lying. Perhaps they are. But at least, if you think they are lying, say so and explain why. If the central bank is telling you, if the government is telling you that they want to rein in lending by the banks, and that they're actually doing so in order to bring inflation down, if you think that they're lying about that, tell us as much. But if, on the contrary, you accept that what they say is true, and bear in mind all of the figures, all of the information about the Russian economy which we have, overwhelmingly comes from the source, which is, of course, the Russian authorities themselves, then, of course, if that is true, if what these people are telling us is true, then we are not in a situation where the government is promoting lending in order to finance the war, and is forcing the banks to lend, and that this is just a form of money printing. So there we are. It's very exhausting talking about the Russian economy all the time. It's really a very easy topic to discuss intelligently because, as I said, all of the information is there, but people seem to prefer their own reality to the actual one. Anyway, I'm not going to say anything more. I'm going to finish here. This is my program for today. We'll see what happens over the next few weeks in Ukraine. We will see whether there is, nonetheless, in spite of everything, some kind of conflict with Iran. I'm not excluding that possibility. I'm just explaining today why there might not be. So more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribe Star by going to our shop. Links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me from today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.